My name is Lachlan Monroe. I'm the director of the School of International Development and Global Studies here at the University of Ottawa. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event called Canada Missing in Action, ? Canada's evaluation of Canada's role on the international scene. This is the launch event of the joint annual meeting of the Canadian Association of International Development Professionals, the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, and this part of it is co-hosted by the School of International Development and Global Studies. So this is the second time that the school and the CCIC have collaborated on such events, and it's our great pleasure to bring town and gown together, theory and practice, and journalism. So thank you all for coming. Merci d'être venus tellement nombreux. Cet événement se déroulera majoritairement en anglais, mais puisque c'est un pays et une université bilingue, si vous voulez poser vos questions, formuler vos critiques et nous faire des commentaires en français, on se fera le plaisir de vous répondre dans la langue officielle de votre choix à travers nos interprètes simultanés très bien formés et excellents spécialistes. Okay, and just a reminder that after this event at 6:30, please come to the reception. The reception will not take place here. As you can see, this is the University Lecture Hall. It wasn't built for cocktails. However, Cabaret Hall, the main building of the university, just north of here, room 112, was built for cocktails. So we hope to see you all there afterwards. So, without further ado, I'd like to pass you to the chair of PADIC, Pamela Branch.
Thank you. And welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people out. We are so happy to be doing this jointly with the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. We feel we brought back International Cooperation Days, and it's really great that so many of you turned out for it. As was mentioned, this is just the kickoff event. We have 2 days coming up of workshops and sessions. We have over 30 sessions. Great speakers from all over the world, from the developing countries, from here in Canada. It's going to be really terrific. It will not be in this building. It will be in the Ottawa Convention Center, so please come there tomorrow morning, and we'll see you then.
Alors bonsoir tout le monde, Chantal Lavard du Conseil canadien pour la coopération internationale. C'est mon tour de vous souhaiter la bienvenue et je vous remercie d'avoir pris le temps d'être ici ce soir. Je pense que vous ne le regretterez pas. Many people have been involved in putting this event together and to make it a dynamic and engaging one. We have to give a very special thanks to Don Martin and his team. In particular, Stephanie Evers. They have been very engaged from the beginning, from the moment that Don said yes. We've discussed the content and format with them. They reached out to MPs to find the right people, and so we are very happy to have them on board. And you know that Don has cancelled his show today so that he could be with us. So make sure that we give him his money's worth. So as most of you know, Don hosts the CTV News Channel daily marquee political program, Power Play, which runs from Monday to Friday. He's a very well-known and respected journalist on Parliament Hill, and he brings 3 decades of experience to his role as the host of Power Play. And before joining CTV, he covered politics in Canada for 32 years at the National Post and Calgary Herald. Don is also an author. He has written the bestseller King Ralph in 2002. It's a biography on the life and times of Alberta Prime Minister Ralph Klein. And in 2006, he published Belinda, following the private political life of Belinda Stronach. So there might be another bestseller in the works. Maybe Don will tell us about that tonight. So it is really a privilege to have him host our event tonight. Please give a warm welcome to Don Martin.
All right, thank you. Just to correct one thing, we didn't cancel Power Play. I put Mercedes Stevenson in the host here, and she's a hell of a lot better looking than me, so the ratings are going up right now. This was a bit of a challenge to get guests. John Bear, I approached him. He said, "Are you kidding? They're going to beat me up for an hour and a half." I said, "Yeah, that's probably true." So we decided to go with 3 MPs, well known as they are, James Dessai, Paul Dewar, and John MacKay. The Harbour government was so afraid of having this discussion that they scheduled the Fair Elections Act vote for precisely the moment we're here. So that canceled out James Dessai, and actually the PMO actually issued me a statement I'm supposed to read to you explaining why he's not here, but I'm not going to bother because you've got better things to listen to. So Paul Dewar was supposed to be here, but given that it's the Unfair Elections Act with the NDP, he felt he had to stay and cast his negative vote. John MacKay, however, a Liberal MP, is under no such constraint. Third place party. So he is here. Elizabeth May would have been here, but her good friend Farley Moa died, and today's the funeral. So this has been a real bit of a challenge to get them together. So John MacKay is a Liberal MP, well known, well respected. I've had him on the show many times. He's spoken on any number of topics. He's currently environment critic, right? Because you've gone through so many, I can't keep track. But you'll get a really spirited discussion. He doesn't live in fear of straying off talking points, so you might hear a few. Keep in mind there's at least one reporter here, so maybe we'll see what he has to say and how newsworthy that is. Neil Dessai is the John Bear, James Dessai stand-in. He's had all of about half a day's notice, but he's had his hand in both worlds. He's an academic as a fellow with the Canadian Defence and Foreign Affairs Institute and the Munch School of Global Affairs here in Toronto. But I find him more interesting because he's a former, hang on, Paul Dewar, come on back! Yeah, we better have Harold is on Harbour enemy number 1 on his list. I was really looking forward to him trash talking everything we were talking about. But Paul Dewar and John MacKay will do precisely that. Neil, however, has some political experience, and now he's free from that, so the sock's been removed from his mouth. So he's willing to crashes about anything. He rated one of Embassy Magazine's most influential foreign policy experts, and he was chief of staff to 2 ministers of international development, including his last act with Bev Oda was to order some orange juice. And then he briefly supervised Julian Fantino's disastrous performance. So, anyway, he'll be great. Paul Dewar, please no introduction after that grand entrance. We were rehearsing that all last night. The drum roll. We had a drum roll last night. Anyway, Paul Dewar is a foreign affairs critic, and he deserves a big kudo for organizing an emergency debate last night on the Nigerian kidnapping of those 200 to 300 schoolgirls. And it was a very emotional one. 6 hours, almost, I think, Paul, 5.5 hours, and for once, I think pretty much everyone agreed with what had to be said. So we'll be talking about that later. So, without further ado, let's rock and roll with some general questions, hopefully get discussion going. This isn't a debate, it's more like a discussion. If you guys want to jump in on each other, I'm more than happy. I don't know how Neil's going to represent John Baird, but this ought to be I guess we'll start with, Chantal gave me some general questions, and I don't follow scripts very well, just ask my producers, but I'll sort of start with the kumbaya question here. She wanted to know what a government could realistically promise, or a party could promise to do, really to deal with reducing poverty and sort of inequality in the world now. So I guess I'm going to have to put 2 of the 3 here as if they were foreign affairs ministers and get them to say what they think their party could to do to answer those questions. So I'm going to start with Paul Dewar. I know that those are big questions. You have to connect it down, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, and well rehearsed from last night. Thanks.
Okay.
Good, yeah. Good to see so many people talking about foreign affairs. I think first off, thank you for coming tonight, and thanks CCIC for the terrific work you've been doing and to organize this. In this multipolar world we're in, there is a lot of shifting and there's a lot of fluid action in world markets, in economies, and one of the things that challenges all governments is, particularly now where we see the rise of the BRIC countries, the ones that we all know well, Brazil, Russia, India, China, is how does a country like Canada, a G7 country, help lift all boats up? How do we deal with development in a very changing world? And I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is just that. It's changed. It's changed from when I was a kid, where we were all going to set off, and when I was 21, I went off to Central America, and I was going to go help those poor people in Central America, right? And I was going to build things and do things. That was good. I learned a lot, and I learned that I couldn't do all that, and I would work with people and take what I learned and hopefully apply it. But I think even that notion that we have now, where we're going to go help those poor people wherever, clearly that's old thinking. And the new thinking should be about how do we work to help people within their own situation develop resources that are theirs after all, for their benefit. And to do that, and this is where we have disagreement with the government, we need to work with people on the ground. We need to work to help people in the case of, say, Sub-Saharan Africa, or be it in Central America where I was before, help them develop their own resources for their own economy, for their own benefit. And let's deal with something right straight up off the top here. We do not go into places like, quote, Africa to help the Africans. What we're doing now in countries in continents like Africa is we are taking resources out and taking wealth out for often our own benefit. So let's be truthful about what the relationship is. And then start to say, okay, how can we deal with a country like we were debating last night, Nigeria, which happens to be now surpassing South Africa in terms of the strongest economy, yet has 10 million children who aren't in school. 6 million of them are girls. Well, the way you do that is you focus on education. The way you do that is you deal with healthcare. The way you do that, and I'll wrap it here, is you deal with women in particular as agents of change. And you do that by being on the ground, working with people, and if I may, not just by supporting Canadian mining companies to do their work to benefit them. Work with people who are living there, who are actually responsible for being stewards of the land to benefit from their own resources, their own wealth, and have a responsible, mature relationship with them.
I find it quite interesting. I think Paul Dewar eloquent talking points here. But I think the challenge I have, being in the ministry and kind of seeing the differences on party politics and development, I actually don't see huge differences. I don't think if Paul were to sit as Minister of International Development, he'd actually do many things that differently. I think Paul would agree that his priority would be education, which has been a priority of the government in development. Maternal and child health would be a priority of the government. Food security. And Paul talks about working with people on the ground was actually a conservative government, not a liberal government that untied Canada's food assistance. So, if you want to talk about working on the ground and giving people a hand up, I think the government actually has some interesting track record on this subject. I think the one area where Paul's getting at, he's not really punching through on it, is economic development. And I think ultimately even the government has some challenges there on how it's actually going to do economic development. For years, the government and all stripes has talked about helping people become self-sufficient in developing countries. It's really struggled with the what. And I find that very interesting because I think largely the work in this space CETA's done and now the new department is doing is largely in the space of governance. So how do you regulate, how do you tax? And these are interesting things and they're very, very important to economies. But there's this other bottom-up phenomenon on developing economies that we're struggling with here domestically, let alone internationally. So I think these are some interesting things that I think we will see some differences growing in the future between the parties and between different, folks who are thinking about these issues. And I don't just mean from a narrow development perspective. There's an interesting thought how we do this here in Canada. How do you develop, how do you create jobs, how do you create long-term economic growth. So I actually think we have a lot to learn from Canadians writ large, not just development professionals.
That's a lousy invitation to John Baird. John MacKay.
Well, thank you, Don. So the question is on how to reduce world poverty. Well, that's by the Liberal Party. What we do, world peace next? Is that the next question? Okay, well, it's narrow right now. So I'm kind of impressed, Don, that you can actually attract an audience like this. It's about twice your national share. Mercedes will do something like that. My view is that we should start with what we already have, which was an application of the Better Aid Bill. And the Better Aid Bill, for those of you who know and went through the war, particularly CCIC folks, said three things. One, our aid needed to be focused on poverty alleviation. Two, it had to be consistent with international human rights standards. And three, novel idea, you actually had to consult with the people that you wanted to affect. Simple bill, but that's where we start. And as a result of many folks like yourselves giving testimony to Commons and Senate committees saying our aid was unfocused, it was wasted, it was et cetera, it was et cetera, et cetera. And since the passage of that bill, the government has paid lip service to it, still hasn't established any metrics, and the reports that were issued because of the obligation to issue a report say virtually nothing worth anything reading. So that's where I would start, with an application, a rigorous application of it. I would also gas the government's fixation on you get our aid if in fact you trade with us. You get our aid if in fact you support us in various diplomatic initiatives. I would gas all of the stuff about putting out aid through mining companies. I don't think you can serve two masters. I understand mining companies. They're there to make a profit for their shareholders. That is not the role of NGOs. And I suppose I could be persuaded that distributing Canadian taxpayers' money for corporate social responsibility through the foreign aid bill was actually beneficial if, in fact, it could be demonstrated that A, it was for the purposes of alleviating poverty, B, it was consistent with international human rights standards, and C, the people who are going to be most affected had actually been consulted. So, on the issue of world poverty, Don, I would start with the application of the Better Aid Bill.
I wouldn't mind your quick rebuttal on that, Paul, because there were some people taking shots at you.
No,
I
think he was just trying to find a point where we agreed on and maybe disagreed. I look at the government's approach, and what I find lacking is actually coherence. I'm not sure what their goals are on any given day. And I'm sure some of the concerns you might have about, and you just enumerated them, about how do you do economic development in a way that is going to be effective. And it certainly is challenges we have at home. I agree with that. In fact, the post-2015 focus after the MDG goals, that's what this is all about, is to take the ideas that we have for international development and maybe take a look at our record at home. And so I agree with you on that, is that we need to not just externalize what we're doing, but be accountable for what we're doing at home. I mean, you talk about economic development and trying to help First Nations here at home, while you're also having to deal with that for people, Indigenous people in Colombia. And you should be able to say, if we're going to ask mining companies or gas companies here in Canada to have a social license to do development and agreements with First Nations, well, I think you should have the same requirement for Canadian companies doing business in places like Colombia. is that an easy thing to do? No, it's not easy to do here, and it's certainly going to be challenging there. So I guess, I would meet you at that point and say that's a challenge, I agree. Where I disagree with the government is that, and this is part of the coherence problem, and John touched on it a bit, it's about consultation. You need to know that this merger of CEDA into DFATE, which has the unfortunate name of defeated, which reminds me of a political party that came together a number of years ago that had a similar nomenclature challenge. Crap. But seriously, it is, the problem is not that it's not a bad idea. The UK did some really smart things in taking their foreign policy and having a coherent development policy along with it. Same with Clinton. Hillary Clinton did some very smart things and looking at how USAID did their work. But they consulted. They consulted within the department. They consulted people in the business. And they actually took a look around the world and consulted people. And then they went ahead and started to do the work they're doing. In our case, I don't know if you know this, but this just in, they didn't consult anyone, including their own deputy ministers, as far as I can tell. That's not a way to reform things. And that's the problem, is that if you're going to do policy changes and shifts, which I agree need to be done, you need to look at the world as it exists and respond, and not live in a time bygone. But by not consulting, clearly you're missing out on where you should go, and that's the biggest challenge this government is facing, is its lack of coherence because it does not consult the people who do know, including the very people who work within their own building. And that's what's very unfortunate, sad, and I can tell you, if we were in government, if I was had the opportunity as minister, I would take my time to do it and do it right and consult people and have knockout discussions with people, have committees look at it. We had one meeting to discuss this at the Foreign Affairs Committee. We could make no recommendations, and the people we had in front of us were as shell-shocked as we were, and they were the people who were supposed to do the actual amalgamation. So that's where I think, Don, we have some differences.
All the majority government. Oh. Neil, you got a quick rebuttal here?
Just something, two points that John made, and I'll then quickly come back here. Just on the focus piece, I think you have to look at a starting point where the government started in 2006, operating in a multiplicity of priorities in 100+ countries. So I agree, the focus is needed development. That a $5 billion budget for around there sounds like a lot of money. But it actually can be one infrastructure project in 1 year. So we really have to kind of get focused. Today, the agency is largely in 20 countries with another kind of, and again, these are by dollar amount, so I don't think, I'm going to get to metrics in a second, and then largely in another 20 countries, 40 countries where we're focusing our money, down from 100, and largely in 5 thematics. Is there room for more focus? Absolutely. I think we need to start melding geography and thematics together. But I think you hit on something that you just kind of flew by that's very important. Metrics. I agree with you. We need to start talking about metrics and less about who is doing the work. And I think we spend so much time in the agency and as a sector in Canada about the who and keeping organizations propped up and less about outcomes that we're actually getting into this trap. Everyone has their hobby horse NGO, including parliamentarians, all stripes, including government MPs. So if you bureaucrats. So I think if you really want a metrics discussion, then you have to have a metrics discussion and talk about what you want to achieve, less about who you want to be doing the work and where.
Here's a weird one. I'm going to go off script.
Oh, God.
I've got this guy here and this guy here, and I can't resist. There's a big maternal health conference coming up, child and maternal health at the end of the month, Stephen Harper hosting. And one of the moves he's made on funding maternal health is not to allow agencies that counsel women on abortion to get funding. And I can't resist that John's here, and John's been making news lately about going against Justin Trudeau's edict. But I'm curious if you could just address, is that a legitimate foreign policy position to take, that you will not fund in countries where population growth is out of control, but another thing, is it improper to lay down foreign policy based on women's right to choose? Paul? No, you on the spot. You're
Well,
welcome.
I find it kind of bizarre that if we are allowing women of Canada to have the choice to the full, all of the aspects of reproductive health, including counsel to abortion and to have those abortion services here in Canada, that we wouldn't allow for that to be the case for women in other countries where we're trying to help them. And to be clear, this isn't about imposing, this is about offering. And, I think Hillary Clinton had it right when she spoke out on it when she was here during the G20. And she just, said very clearly, you cannot have, full reproductive health options for women if you disclude abortion. And I agree with that, and I just find it interesting also that the Americans, again, they put caveats on abortion at home, but they do the opposite of us. They actually offer abortion services to women abroad, but that's a domestic issue that the Americans are fighting for.
First lady,
Just very quickly, Paul, as an aspiring foreign minister, you should know that the base principle of diplomacy is sovereignty. The number, in the majority of the countries that are in this case what is going on-demand abortion is illegal. So,
No, I said offered, right? I said not imposed.
well,
Was that what did I say?
I hear
Active
that,
listening.
but it's
Okay, what did I say?
It's interesting that we still have this debate in countries. We're still having this debate in countries
I'm
where
not debating you, I'm asking you a question. What did I say? I said offer.
offer, but
Good, thanks.
But do you-
That's all I want. I don't want to look
So, sorry, John, but you got a position on this?
thanks, Don.
You're welcome. I just like this chair. I'll go back to the script after.
As I see it, this is a bit of a proxy fight, and it's not so much about what's in the best interest of people to whom we might actually offer aid, particularly with respect to maternal health, but it is, if you will, a mirror image of the fundamentalists on both sides of the debate, arguing and using this as a leverage for their to enhance their own position. So I actually just find it more false fight and somewhat discouraging. Having talked to the people that are on the ground who are actually dealing with fistulas and various other issues pertaining to maternal health, particularly in the most poor countries, this does seem to be an indulgence on the part of some debaters. There I would criticize both sides, both pro-choice and pro-life crowd. I wanted to go back though to Neil's issue and talk about what was a $5 billion budget is now a $3 billion budget and is now plus all the lapses, which apparently we can't find enough poor people in the world to get our money out. And the folding of the department into foreign affairs and trade, and the subservience of CETA to trade and to foreign affairs, which speaks to the issue that CETA is clearly the junior partner. And to disagree with Paul, but to emphasize the point about focus, which is I think the government is very focused. They tell us every day. Focus like a laser, that's what John Baird says all the time. And the focus like a laser is on what's in Canada's best interest. That's the only question that gets asked. So if we will pick one of the 20 countries, if in fact they trade with us, if in fact they do business with us, or if in fact we can we have diplomatic interests that are of advantage to us. That's the question. We're moved from all of these other 100 countries into essentially the Western Hemisphere because we thought this was a thing that was good for poverty alleviation. We moved to the Western Hemisphere, particularly Central and South America, for one reason and one reason only. That's where we do a heck of a lot of business. And that, I think, is why aid is such a mess in this country.
Nice segue, John. I don't know. I think just like this is what happens on the show all the time. Ask a question, and off he goes to the direction he wants to go.
You think I'm going to answer your question?
No, I didn't think. Oh, it might be a first day or something like that. Let's pick up something all of you have far Canada goes in acting as a sheriff on mining standards or on clothing, hiring children in clothing manufacturers. How far should we go? I mean, where's our responsibility begin? Where does it end? I'll start with you first.
Sure. Well, I'll just come back to some of the earlier discussion of mining. Just correct a couple of facts, correct a couple of comments made here. The government has never subsidized mining firms, not $1 ever run through a mining firm. And a couple of realities here. If Canadian mining firms weren't mining in the places they do, others would. I think we can all agree on that. I think we can agree that artisanal miners. I think we have to have relevant discussions on absolute discussion. Mining firms have a lot of challenges, and Canadian mining firms themselves have challenges. But I think we have to have a relative discussion. I found it quite interesting in my time at CETA and then the new department, how often developing country regulators came to us looking for advice on the regulation of their sectors. I was surprised. When I read the newspaper coming into the job, I was thinking that there's no way anyone would be looking to us for advice. So I think we sometimes are very critical of ourselves, but I think you have to have a relevant discussion of what's going on in Tanzania, what's going on in DRC, in Peru, Colombia, and places like that. I thought that was fantastic. I mean, these countries see our system as one that they can learn from. They do not always emulate it, but learn from. On the CSR specific, on that specific piece, I have a real hard time with the marketing aspects of CSR. I mean, a lot of companies would come to us to ask, will you finance our hospital out in the middle of nowhere that makes us feel good about ourselves doing business in this country? I don't think you should celebrate that. I don't even think you should do it personally, not the government side. But when organizations came to us and said, legitimately, we see a challenge here. We're paying for people to go from Toronto or Vancouver to go work in low skill, still high skills by the mine standards, but low skills by Canadian standards jobs, because we can't attract quality people who are skilled or who are healthy to come to work every day. That to me is something that it might not be called CSR, but it's actually solving a lot of issues, economic issues, getting wages higher in local communities, social cohesion issues. I'm going to make an inference that if you work for an organization and have a good experience, you're less likely to protest it. So I think that for me, getting out of this kind of bucket of CSR, I think there are some good initiatives here. We need smart, kind of lean organizations to implement these. Because frankly speaking, we're not going to give money to a mining company, nor should we. But there does need to be constructive players. And I think largely after the initial negative response, I think every kind of NGO in Canada has kind of come around to this idea that it is an industry, frankly speaking, that it's going to be there regardless. And a constructive approach is better than a negative approach.
Okay, future foreign affairs minister Paul Dewar.
Some interesting things. Well, let me just start off with what I think should be the case. Let me take you back to Bangladesh a year ago. And young girl, 11-year-old girl by the name of Tanina goes to work. She doesn't want to go to work. She tells her manager she doesn't want to go to work. She goes to work, and the next day, we know what happens, right? The Rana Plaza collapses. She lives, but 1,000 of her co-workers die. She's 11 years old. She probably wants to go to school. I agree that she is, for those of you who probably would agree with this, is that she's bringing money in that's needed for the household. And there are a lot of people who would argue that the rise of Bangladesh has been because they have been able to attract capital to invest, to provide for jobs, to lift some people out of poverty. Fine. But when I go and buy a shirt at Joe Fresh, I want to know that an 11-year-old girl isn't being forced to go to work so I can have cheap clothes. So for me, yeah, it's not just about tags of CSR. It's about a contract we have. And our contract is with those companies who do business abroad, who are Canadian, have to adhere to certain regulations. And what are they? Well, they should be something in line with what we have here in Canada. That's the basic premise we should be starting with. Are they going to be exactly the same? Of course not. But we need to be looking at how that 11-year-old girl is going to have the same access to education and to livelihood as my sons did when they were 11 years of age. So how do you do that? Well, what we did at the Foreign Affairs Committee is we brought Joe Fresh into the committee right after that happened last year. And then we just brought him back a week ago to find out what the progress was. Well, turns out they've done some good things. They have signed on to an accord that was negotiated in Geneva that would have certain standards and responsibilities that would have consequences if they don't follow them. Joe Freshwood, along with other companies. That's a starting point. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, is that the government isn't pushing this and saying all Canadian companies should do this. Only one Canadian company has done this. And let's be frank, they were implicated in the Rona Plaza, and that's why they decided to do this, and I applaud them for it. But that's what CSR looks like. It's having Canadian companies adhere to basic standards and then to work towards bettering the lives of the people of whom which we are contracting with. And if we were able to, and I'll finish with this, and I said this at committee and asked the representative from Joe Fresh a year ago if he would agree that this would be something we should do. Why not have that embedded in our foreign policy and trade policy? Why not have the experts who are from CETA informing our trade officials what that looks like and working as a team? And not to have the CETA folks being the orphans to the trade folks, and actually working in partnership to develop a coherent CSR policy so that we have our trade officials not just going out and getting deals, but we have people who are actually putting standards on the ground so that Tamina, the 11-year-old, isn't going to have to go to work in a place that is going to kill her.
You might be foreign affairs minister. All right, Jonathan.
Thanks, CSR has become a far more important issue over the last number of years, in part, I think, driven by the debate in Parliament, and in part driven by the debate around C-300. You remember that the genesis of C-300 was that Canada needed an ombudsman to mediate and arbitrate on mining disputes. And that report was tabled. In fact, I think maybe one or two authors of that report in this room. And then it was ignored. And then it was retabled. And it was ignored. And so, hence C-300. And many of you will know the glorious failure of the C-300, who died by 6 votes. And that drove the conversation about CSR, and in some respects, some of the companies got religion. Not many, but some. And so, I think development of peace is back to driving the issue we need an ombudsman. That's point one. Go crazy. Go crazy. Point two. We all know that corruption kills development. And that's about as direct a line as you can make. And so Revenue Watch and others wanted us to go forward with C-474, which was a bill which said that every 6 months, after a 6 month year end, a company had to tell the government of Canada how much they paid, what currency they paid in order to get a mining concession. File. That's all you need to do. On the theory that if you shine a light on payments, there's less chance that it will be corrupt. That bill was defeated. The Prime Minister made clucking noises under huge pressure at the last G8 meeting, and we're told by former Minister Joe Oliver that if there is not progress made, that he will introduce legislation on April the 1st, 2015 to impose this kind of a regulatory environment. Now, anyone who knows anything about the parliamentary cycle, and I know Don, you know a great deal about it, knows that when a government's likely lifespan is going to end somewhere between September and November 2015, introducing legislation in April 1st, there's not a chance. There's not a chance that any legislation will pass. So that's point two, corruption. Point 3 is with respect to the ability of aggrieved persons to be able to sue in the country where the company has its head office. And in this respect, Murray Clipperstein has done a tremendous job in bringing forward the Hudbay case. And I think, frankly, that should be legislated. I think that Canadian courts need to be opened up to aggrieved persons who have various complaints with the activities of various mining companies. So those would be 3 points that I put forward as ways out of or moving forward on corporate social responsibility, so that it's not just a feel-good thing.
Okay, in a few minutes I'm going to go to the mic, so if anyone wants to get ready to ask questions, let's do one more quick round of talks on this. And I want to start with Neil on this. When DFAID and CETA merged, a lot of people were just scratching their heads, is there really a CETA minister anymore? And then we saw how they suddenly started to tailor foreign policy to economic considerations. And I'm wondering, this, in your view, since you were linked with ministers then, does CETA actually exist, or is John Baird the minister, and are they really looking at foreign policy strictly from economic advantage?
Since we're at university, I'll go academic on this. Structurally, today, the development program of the government of Canada is actually stronger than it was under CETA. It had no legal standing in the old system enacted CETA. There was legislation that John talked about earlier that defined how the government of Canada would have to do development. But it could argue on the levels, it could decide to shut down the agency, frankly, with the signature on a letter. So from a raw legal perspective, today the development program actually has principles and law. The law actually stipulates that there will be a Minister of International Development. Again, the previous Foreign Affairs Act speculated that there could be a Minister of International Cooperation, which I have to say is quite old nomenclature, and a lot of developing countries tended to point that out, that they had foreign relations. We had foreign relations with rich countries, but cooperated with poor cousins. So, I mean, I can argue today that from an academic perspective, you're actually in a better place, but I think issues become as important as those who care about them care about them. So, I mean, I often said that development wasn't taken seriously when I was in government because we didn't take it seriously inside the government. So I think this idea that trade is driving development, I think it actually works from the inside of the government, actually works the other way around. I think people who are motivated working in government look around their environment and say, these are the government's narratives, these are the government's desires today. This is what it's trying to achieve on behalf of Canadians, this is who we work for. So if we can meet multiple objectives, we can reduce poverty, but also deliver a long-term dividend. And I don't mean narrow corporatist interests, but I'm talking about long-term prosperity or security delivered through things like education or through maternal and child health, then maybe we should be articulating the work we do in those terms. So I think, again, a nuance of what you said, I agree with you, but it's a matter of circumstance.
Great. John?
I listened to Neil, I don't know what he said. I know what a structural change means. I look at the three ministers and I say, who has more influence in cabinet? John Baird, Ed Fast, or Christian Berry? I don't think I need to stretch that point too much further than that. I think the government is focused. I think it's very focused.
Like a laser?
Like a laser. You can hear repetitive ad nauseum that they're there to do trade agreements. They're there to enhance and foster Canadians' business interests. You'll seldom, if ever, hear a laser-like focus on poverty reduction in third world countries. Maybe I missed that. In some respects, Neil was right. These are the marching orders of this particular government, and people in developing countries don't vote.
Okay, Paul.
Here I'll shock everyone. I'll agree with my friend Timur, right? And that is, there was changes made legislatively that I think are to be acknowledged, and I would actually see something positive out of them. And that is what he described as taking CEDA and putting it into a different structure and giving it more authority. I agree with that. But I also mentioned earlier that the way it was done, and process matters here. And, you know, giving legal entity to CEDA, or to the development minister, is a good thing. And it should be aligned with the foreign policy objectives of any government. I will go back to my claim earlier that I don't see this government as having a coherent, you know, they might have focused on certain things like a laser, as John said, but honestly, coherent objectives and goals. And the reason is they are not consulting even their own department, let alone people outside. And I think, you know, with due respect, we're talking about some agencies now, or sorry, NGOs that you claim have understood that there's this different relationship. But how many people have we thrown to the side who were experts in the field? And yes, you should challenge, cajole NGOs to do things differently, and that's fine. But what we've done is that we've cut ties and thrown them off to the side of the road, and that's unfortunate, because what we've done, what the Conservatives have done, is that the people who are experts in the field, who have networks on the ground, who can leverage resources and do the kinds of things that you can't do sitting in an office in Ottawa, due respect to my hometown, those connections are gone. And that's what's so unfortunate here. And I think it was out of fright by the government. They just didn't know how to do the game. So they decided to throw them out, and we'll bring some new people in, and our ideas will prevail. I think that's where they got it terrifically wrong. What they did right was to consider giving the development minister new authorities and putting in legislation. That's great. Everything else failed miserably, unfortunately.
Just very quickly, I want to get to the other questions before. I hear this a lot, that Baird makes up all the foreign policy, I think it's Harvard. Baird makes all the foreign policy, and the department's feeling quite maligned and sidelined in a lot of the policy development. Is that true? Is it top down, or is there something coming out through the departments?
I won't speak to specifics on specific policies here, but I think, interesting enough, if you look at previous foreign ministers, and you talk to government caucus about how collaborative the approach was, they would tell you it was very top-down, department driven, pre-Minister Baird. So, I mean, perspective is very important here.
Lawrence Cannon was driving policy.
So, again, I'm not telling you that Minister Baird isn't a strong personality and has views and knows how to work the cabinet process. But I would actually say that in some way he collaborates and consults more. I mean, the number of times he would come with NDP priorities to us at development saying, can you consider this? I think the room would find that surprising. What happens behind the scenes in Ottawa is very surprising to a lot of people. It's not what happens on your show.
Okay. Anyone wants to beat up on Yale? Has anyone got any questions up there that you want to go to the mic and ask? Okay, go out there. Maybe you can introduce yourselves and direct it to whoever you want to direct it to.
Yes. Hello, my name is Galvin. I'm a PhD student at the University of Ottawa. So thanks for the discussion. And my question is addressed to everyone. Just before that, I would want to thank Mr. Dewar for your office pursuing my immigration file with the CIC very closely. It really helped out.
This is double play.
Yeah, anyways. Coming from a developing country, I realize that foreign development discussions normally become very political, which is intriguing and interesting. However, on a sociological note, I would like to ask that how much these programs take into account the influential role of the existing structure, or how do we reconstruct the embodied, role of or how do we represent or collaborate with the educational or ideological system that is already in place? Or, to just very concise, how do we avoid becoming top-down and one-sided? Thank you.
All right. That's awesome. Sure.
I'll kick it off, and I think there'll be a lot of interesting comments from all of us, but I think you start with having people on the ground who are going to be able to make that connection and assessments on the ground. And this is where diplomacy is really important. In other words, foreign service officers on the ground working with development people. And I know there's a lot of competition with each, but if people have their objectives clear, then tremendous things can happen. And so it means that I think what you're hinting at is, and what I find problematic is often we talk about, quote, failed states. Well, there are people living in these places, and they are figuring out ways to organize themselves despite all of the chaos in their lives. And I think that matters. And I think that matters because if you're going to help with nation building or state building or just developing communities, then you need to understand who is on the ground at that time where you're trying to engage and help them at where they're at, not where you're at. And simply put, that requires having people on the ground working in collaboration to do just that. And not coming with your fixed ideas and going to the ground and saying, this is how it should work. And that's why, with respect, I have concerns about the approach to have, it's not mining companies doing the development, but having NGOs doing development alongside the mining companies. Because, whose development are you worried about in that case? And we had a study of foreign affairs that the government asked for, and that was, what is the role of the private sector in development? What was fascinating about that was the study, was that the government thought that they would get all sorts of adherence to their policy. What happened was the people who have been doing that kind of work, partnership with private sector on the ground in certain countries, actually told the conservatives that what they're doing is very different. And that it's not about our private sector, it's about the private sector or the people on the ground that you're trying to help, and that you basically got it wrong. So that all to say, the way you do it, I believe, and we had experiences in Afghanistan, and I mentioned what's happening in Nigeria as an example most recently. Look at what their basic needs, and development used to talk about basic needs strategy 1,000 years ago. It's still relevant. It's a matter of connecting with people to find out what their basic needs are and working with them to build things from the ground up.
Okay, John MacKay, maybe a bit shorter.
Thanks. I'd like to give you the rest of the time for something else. I think the core question is who do you trust? That's what it boils down to, and how you develop that trust. And if you eviscerate Canadian NGOs who may have been in the country for a number of years and actually develop their own structures and their own understanding of who to trust and who not to trust, you have a basis on which you can move forward. And then once you've figured out who you can trust, then it becomes working with the structures, the indigenous structures, if you will, in those countries. Because nothing derails aid and assistance more quickly than corruption or money that goes south or can't be explained or whatever. Don and his colleagues in journalism just get bent right out of shape about Canadian taxpayers' money going off the rails. So I'd say you got to have consistency in the NGOs. That means consistency of funding for the NGOs. That means consistency of interaction with the government, the Canadian government, and their NGO. You develop a core level of trust, and you have to be able to demonstrate that the NGO / Government of Canada actually consulting the people that they want to benefit. Strange concept, but why don't we ask the people first as to what, and that may not be the same as the structures or the government. That seems to be important.
Okay. Sure. I think it was, but anyway, no problem. Yeah.
I was going to give you a very academic answer again, but I'll share a personal story about my starting point in development. I'm not a development professional. Everyone here has much more experience. But when I took the job, my parents, who are children of the developing world, they told me, don't assume automatically that you know better. And that's an important starting point. We do some electoral work. Canada does electoral work in Kenya, and I found it interesting during this debate about the Fair Elections Act here domestically, that we, Canada, were supplying biometric technology to identify voters in Kenya. So this presumption that we're always the teacher and they're always the learner is a very, very poor starting point. I'll just say that on the academic side of it, there is a principle that most of our agency has, including Canada, that your primary work through is always the government if you can. And then you work down, you're supposed to work down through the best mechanism for results. Now, I'll just say that that's not always the case because there are vested interests. American agencies like working with American NGOs and such. So we do have to break some of those kind of entrenched positions if we really do fundamentally believe in the mandate of poverty alleviation. I'll leave it at that. So.
Okay, no. I went through a lot of the questions. Is there another one up there? Is that all the lineup for questions, by the way, from you, sir? Oh, okay, well, let's keep it even tighter, guys. Okay, we're going to get through them all.
Hi, my name is MacKay. I've worked in Canadian NGOs for a while, and I share Paul's view that we've learned some things. And about 15 years ago, I heard someone, a colleague, at an International Cooperation Day saying, we used to say, give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day, teach him to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. But now I think the idea is to stop stealing his fish. And I think Canada is actually not missing in action from the places that I've been, the FAO, the CBD. It's quite activist, actually. And the WTO, when it was functioning, it was a very activist presence that blocked all the initiatives coming from least developed countries. And in my travels and in my time with people, and I don't think it would be surprising to anyone here, nobody says we want more aid. They want better aid, but they actually want to stop having their fisheries siphoned off and resources extracted. And we know that that model of resource extraction doesn't actually bring changes. My question that I find absent in this discussion, and that I know is on the minds of a lot of Canadians, especially young Canadians and the people in the South, is Canada's role in addressing the environmental issues that we face as humanity. And resource extraction is a huge contributor to all kinds of problems, to pollution, to people being expropriated from their land and their livelihoods, and to climate change. And so I'd like to put that table into the room because I'd like to hear what the parties have to say about Canada's role internationally in managing these issues.
Yeah, I'm going to start with you, Andy. You took a shot at me.
Fair point. There's a lot in there. There's more to state than a question. Is there any specific you wanted me to touch on?
No, she asked a question.
Okay, well, you make some good points there. My only, going back to your question of resource extraction, whether it's fisheries or mining, I go back to this point that we kind of act as though we're the world here, and we're debating as though every decision we make will shift everyone else's decisions. Again, I look at mining as a relative, not an absolute. I've seen firsthand what others in the world consider appropriate mining practices. So again, we kind of sit here in Canada and bemoan certain companies for their practices, and we should. But again, we should do that relative to artisanal mining, to Chinese mining in Africa and Latin America and such. On your questions of the environment, I think you're absolutely right. I think these are some real challenges. The government incorporates environmental studies into all of its development programming, regardless of the priority thematic. Is it going to be a challenge going forward? Absolutely, because if you ask the developing country regulators, they'll say they're wrestling with this issue. We wrestle with economic growth versus the environment, and it's integral to our kind of what we call prosperity. Now think about it when you're starting from a base, where $1.25 a day actually sounds good. So I would be respectful of those starting points and those base points when we try to impose kind of global targets on emission standards and things like that.
Are we stealing their fish, John?
We're stealing them, we're walking out the door, we're eating them. Yes. we're down to recommendations, and you're probably many people put forward a recommendation about how the impact of climate change on the Great Lakes watershed. That report will not have any reference to climate change on Great Lakes watershed. So there we are. As far as the government's position on climate change, it is a phrase that one will not mention under any circumstances, and no matter how great the torture. So how is it that a country that withdrew from Kyoto has done absolutely nothing about GHG emissions in the oil and gas sector, even to the point of actually impairing its own economic initiatives? How is it that it's got anything to say to any country in any part of the world, whether it's an impoverished country or it's a developed country? So my problem with it is that this government is clearly missing in action on this particular file. And it's actually worse than missing in action. It basically says we're 2% of the problem, nothing that can be done, and I know that that great honking chunk of ice in the western Antarctic just fell in the ocean, and water levels are going to rise by 3 meters. We can't do anything about it.
Well, okay. Just quick about it.
Just very quickly, I think it's a rich position to point those out. But John's party spent a long time in government in this country and really missed spectacularly its Kyoto commitments. And one thing that the time between development and this issue, I think, is strong for the government. That and it is a differing position on these issues. That if you were going to commit to something internationally, actually achieve it, whether it's environment or food security. The government set out some very ambitious food security targets, and it's met them every year. John's party, unfortunately, never met the food aid commitments while in government. So, I mean, what might not seem ambitious to average onlookers actually is achievable targets. It's nice to have aspirations, I get that. But you actually also have to achieve something.
It would be nice to even have any aspirations at all.
No, I think your question, you acknowledged something very important. You said that NGOs have, and your own experience, have learned that things have to change. And I think that's really important to state, because everyone has had to acknowledge that. And one of the things that we talked about Kyoto, one of the mechanisms was the CDM mechanism within Kyoto, was I think a very smart idea. It needed some work and some innovation. What was that? It was essentially taking what we had as international agreements, and for big emitters to actually, the polluter pay principle, which I fundamentally believe in, and that some of that money would go to help developing countries adapt to climate change, because it turns out we're all responsible for this, and the big emitters more responsible than the others. And what we have in the world right now is, I'll call it climate injustice, because if you are someone in sub-Saharan Africa, you have already had to confront adaptation. And those of us in the north and those of us who are the big emitters weren't exactly there for you earlier, saying, how can we help to adapt? That's what we missed. And that's what we need to focus on, and that's some of the new thinking we have to have. It's not just about, bringing water to people who need water. It's about people who are having to deal with adaptation because of climate change. And that's why the CDM mechanism within Kyoto shouldn't be forgotten. Maybe people don't like Kyoto, and maybe they didn't like the fact that we didn't have everyone in, but the principle that the big emitters have a responsibility globally to do something to help those people who were most affected by climate change needs to be a principle in our foreign policy and in our development policy.
I think the part that Paul forgets to mention is the government at Copenhagen pledged $1.1 billion in addition to the development budget. So that's outside of the development budget, developing countries, for mitigation, and
along with the $1 billion subsidy to to oil and gas, and we still are.
So the mechanism actually still exists.
We could, yeah, you're right, fair.
It's just, you have to give the whole story, that's it.
That's fair.
And the chances of meeting Copenhagen targets between nil and
But
zero.
no, you're.
You have a future in politics. All right, I'm very good at ending on time, and we only have 10 minutes left. So are you the last question, sir? Or is there- Okay, you're all in line for questions? Oh, okay. Go ahead. Oh, that's not what it is, okay. That's the Paul Dewar fan club.
So my name is Marco, and I'm a reporter at the Toronto Star, and I'm actually on leave right now because I've gotten the James Travers Fellowship. And I'm going to be traveling overseas to be looking at the mining company NGO partnerships in Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Peru, and I leave next week. So I've been researching a lot into the context under which these developments or these partnerships came about, and obviously one of the big developments that happened beforehand was the merger of DFADE and CEDA. And under this, under this new ministry, we've got Canadian companies and Canadian NGOs being taken care of under the same roof, if you will, in foreign embassies. And I'm mostly interested in the sense over the last few years I've been speaking to, or the last few months, excuse me, I've been speaking to lots and lots of development professionals who've been telling me that their budgets are getting slashed, they're no longer getting funding from the government that they have been receiving for decades, and that that rules are being interpreted in certain ways, and that it's incredibly strict now. If you want to get money from the government as an NGO, you have to meet incredibly strict standards. And I guess my question is, now that these NGOs are under the same roof as the Canadian corporations working abroad, where are the standards for Canadian corporations? I've spoken to several diplomats off the record because, as you know, diplomats aren't allowed to speak to the media anymore. So they all told me that in many cases there is no mechanism whatsoever to cut off a Canadian company. A Canadian company can flagrantly not pay attention to local law, cannot follow the procedures, cannot follow Canadian policy. They can be the worst offenders in the world, and Canadian embassies are obliged to provide them with assistance in working overseas. So I'm wondering whether there's any thought of that, or if this ever came up, this sort of double standard in terms of the way that NGOs and corporations are dealt with abroad.
Look at that, a real journalist asking a tough question. That's not fair when your head would explode right now. I wouldn't mind you starting out.
Congratulations, first of all, that's fantastic, and it's a great subject to go after. Just a couple things on your timeline. The mining partnership started well before there was consideration of a merger, so I think that comes first. CEDA's always been co-located with foreign affairs. Trade officials largely are in some of the smaller missions and developing country missions. Trade commissioners are also diplomats dealing with the government on multiplicity of issues. So I think just, again, don't come with an editorial bias too early in the process. I think just go try and discover the facts. I think a couple of things that I'll just pass on to you, again, without putting my own editorial spin on it. Talk to domestic regulators, talk to local community groups, because they were part of that process on creating these partnerships. And also just, again, do report on the scale of these projects, that there were 3 projects that you're talking about that constituted less than 1% of the development budget over the 3 years that they were running. So I think, were they perfect? Now I'll put the editorial bend on, no. Were they interesting? Absolutely. And was there demand from them locally, as my colleagues here talk about so much? Absolutely. So I think if those are the metrics of why you do development, then I think it was a good endeavor.
Okay, Paul.
I referenced before the need to have a different model than obviously the one we have now, and that I would suggest is to have those in development who are experts in areas like corporate social responsibility inform our diplomatic corps and our trade officials. Ultimately, that would be the case wherein, so my example of my friend from Joe Fresh, when I said to him, who's informing you about how to do your work. And he said, well, we've had some very nice people in the embassy, and it's true, we did. But wouldn't it be more helpful if we had someone who was able to help navigate what's happening on the ground in Bangladesh with regulators and what regulations they should adhere to, and not be seen as just a hanger-on, as, oh, that's the development person, right? That they actually have status and they take their expertise and apply it. Your point about not having to adhere to and who are they accountable to is something I have discovered. I right now have a bill in front of Parliament on conflict minerals in the Congo. And it's to have companies be accountable in their supply chain, in this case to make sure that their supply chain is a clean supply chain. Just like we did with blood diamonds. And Ian Smiley, who's in front of me here, was responsible for helping that process back in decades ago, because we saw what was happening with diamonds. There's ways, in other words, to bring in regulations if we want them. And that's something that I don't think anyone would disagree, that we should have some regulatory framework for Canadian companies abroad. It's a matter of what it looks like. John talked about an ombudsman. Apparently there's a rally tomorrow at noon, by the way, in Parliament Hill to support an ombudsman if you're looking for something to do at noon in Parliament Hill. But no, that's another way of doing it. And I think we have to agree that the status quo is not an option. It's a matter of how do we innovate and look at ways in which we make sure that Canadian companies are being able to do what they need to do, but do it in a responsible way, and that our governments are there, not just to pitch for trade deals, but also to make sure that we're in compliance with the norms that we would have to adhere to here in Canada.
Okay, John, last word here?
Last word.
Last word. Well, I got one quick one.
Oh, sorry.
It's got a cigarette.
Yeah. I wrote an article called You Can't Serve Two Masters. Not very profound, and certainly no professional journalist am I. But nevertheless, it seemed to me that was the inherent conflict getting mining companies to deliver aid. I talked to 2 out of the 3 NGOs that are in those 3 countries that you mentioned. The one NGO was keen to tell me that it's really working well, we're very pleased with the whole thing, et cetera, et cetera. The second NGO was having huge food fights at its board meeting about what the heck they were actually doing, what they were getting into. And they had some blowback from their donors. You know, you're going to take their money, well, you don't need mine. That was a big problem. And it puts pretty well everyone in a pretty awkward position, because NGOs have a clear mandate. Corporations have clear mandates, and those 2 mandates don't necessarily go together. And while Neil says that it's only 1% and it's an experiment and all that sort of stuff, I'm not sure I'd be continuing with this experiment were I the minister. So I commend you for pursuing that, because I think you hit on a rather sensitive issue for NGOs, especially in light of the fact that it's pretty tough to get money these days.
Okay. Well, we're going to wind up quickly now. I want you guys to answer it in 1 minute. Look at the electoral cycle. We got about a year left in this government, and then presumably you could have a majority government for 4 years. So I want you to just look on a 5-year frame and tell me what you think is the most urgent foreign policy fix that needs to be done in the next 5 years. Start with you, Paul.
It's just the merger that we've seen occur, and that's the structure of governance, and that is something that I would want to deal with immediately, because anything else you do, your goal is to say you want to provide, let's say Canada should focus on water, for instance, which I think would be a great idea. Canada go out there and champion that. How are you going to do it? And you're going to have to ensure that this merger that we've just seen is not going to be a barrier to that. So I think it is. I know it's boring, but hey, we're in Ottawa here. We all talk about structures and functions and whatnot. I think that would be the thing we have to figure out. And then I get back in the business of multilateralism. I didn't have a chance to talk about all the things we pulled out of. No one knew what the Treaty on Desertification and Drought was until we pulled out of it, I think. Some of us did, but it's get back in the game of the UN, and talk about things like reforming the UN. I'm no fan of the status quo, and I think so for many of us who have been cornered, saying, well, you just think that the UN is great. No, but I want to improve it. And so improve the structures of the things that are failing, and I'd start with this merger that we've seen, and then work out from that. Get back in the game, tell all of our talented young people and those who have been toiling for many years in development and diplomacy, come back home, we need you, let's get back in the game.
No, actually.
I'm just a visitor, it's Bologna.
Oh, really? Neil, just put yourself in conservative mindset. What would you do?
This is for any of the parties, actually. It's something that I believe strongly in. It's development financing. I mean, yours was boring, and mine's going to be really boring. Whether we sit here, and I think the title of the conference a lot has to do with budgets and levels, and to me, these are moot points. That the difference between $5 and $4 billion is not solving the world's problems. I think what we actually have to do is look at new ways of how we deliver development, specifically on the financing side. I think on the traditional human development side, we're actually doing fantastic things, but we need to finance it better. We've used this one tool, the traditional grant, 80% of the money kind of put out on the front end as our only go-to. And those who are kind of making in smaller marketplaces really exponential gains are using new financial tools. So it's one that I offer up. There's no kind of ideology behind it. There's no partisanship behind it. I actually think it's something folks should get behind.
Okay, last word, John.
Well, let me answer your question with an experience I had. I was invited to address the United Nations on at an aid conference. It was kind of a big deal. I was impressed by myself. Unfortunately, no one else was. So I went down, and we were having this aid conference, and it was, I don't know, once every 2 or 3 years, and it was kind of a gathering of everyone. And all the countries were represented by either their UN ambassador or their minister. Canada, on the other hand, was represented by a senior team leader. Seems impressive. Yes. Each country spoke and said what they were doing in aid or not doing in aid, as the case may be. And Canada's intervention was, we are having a book launch at the embassy at noon on Friday. You're all invited. That was Canada's contribution to this pretty high-powered aid conference. So I joined with Paul in the view that we got to get back in the game. It would be nice to stop dissing the United Nations. If the United Nations didn't exist, you'd have to invent it. It is a talk shop. It is a talk shop among all peoples, some of whom are extremely obnoxious and corrupt. However, as Winston Churchill famously said, yak yak is better than war war. and that's probably the way we have to go. So I think that's your number one takeaway. And when you get back in the game, maybe there's some chance that some of these other issues can be achieved.
Okay, we're told that it's 6:25, 6:27. I just want to say particular thanks to Neil Dessai, who gave it Paul and John for missing their important folks. wind things up.
Thanks very much, Tom. And thanks to all the panelists. Like you, Don, I feel special solidarity with Neil. I used to work in a minister's office myself, so I know what dealing with MPs is like. And sitting between two of them, in the presence of the media and a bunch of academics, is a nightmare I would never have. Even my boss from that era. That's all.
We are at the convention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think if we can all agree on one thing, it's that we've had a wonderful panel here. We've had a stimulating panel. And I think it's a great kickoff of the CCIC kind of joint event. So I'd like you all to join me, please, in thanking our panelists and thanking one another.